Australia. Andrew's got a fantastic CV, which I'm sure he'll give you a little resume of himself, but he's spent years working and researching with horses to really try and understand them more, so that our relationship with them can be better, and we can both achieve what we want to achieve. And also work with elephants as well, which maybe will come up in the questions later. So Andrew, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a really great privilege to do this, and I really appreciate it so much. Well, getting up early is not such a big problem, because I think last week I had to get up at 3:30 for a UK meeting and then a conference. So that's not such a problem. What is a small problem, but I don't think it will emerge, is that I'm not at my home. I'm at my daughter's place 20 minutes away, because we've had major storm damage, and there are so many trees that have fallen on power lines that we've had no electricity for a week. So you may hear the sound of children, but anyway, the parents are doing a good job keeping them occupied. So this talk is about speaking horse and about horse communication. And of course, it's a very important area, because how do we get the message across to our horses? And there are so many areas where we miscommunicate, and we're not really always aware of it, because often there's a kind of anthropomorphic assumption that the horses just understand what we want. And maybe people are right sometimes, and maybe they're not. But at the heart of it, communication really speaks to training, and horse training speaks to how horses learn. So I'll be touching on that a little bit. But I want to take a bit of a journey also through the horse's senses and then their basic wiring. So I guess the thing to realize before I move on to the first slide is the horse evolved. You know, we've had horses in domestication for 5,000 to 6,000 years, and we've subjected them to selective breeding over that time. It's a relatively short time compared to, say, dogs. But in that time, we've made some dramatic differences to horses in terms of their form and their size and their colouring. But there's certain elements of their hardwiring that we just haven't been able to change as much as we'd like to. So we've softened them a bit, and we've made them more easy to habituate to stimuli, which is a good thing. So they adapt to our human environment quite well, but nonetheless, they are creatures of the open grassland, and that's a very special place, rather like the environment for antelopes in Africa, etc., where you're always in the view of your predators, which makes a big difference, whereas cattle evolved in swampy woodland regions, and there you can hide. And so what this means is the horse has very good senses and very good flight response, which is something that we've utilized for horse sports, but it's also the bane of our lives when it comes to problems. So moving on, and I'm going to be talking about the horse's senses in a bit, just briefly going through them. When we look at the horse's vision, the horse has a very different eye to ours. And the first thing I want to talk about is that the horse is a trichromat, that is three basic colors. A dichromat, two basic colors, and we are trichromats with three basic colors. And what it basically means is that the horse is red-green colorblind. And so their abilities to discriminate between red and green is poor or completely lacking, according to the latest literature. And myself and Maria Rawvang and Britton Nielsen wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, a review of horse sensory abilities. So vision was one thing that came up, because they have such large eyes. They've got almost the largest eyes of any mammal, and certainly relative to their body size too. And what is also really important that we don't necessarily realize is that when you have color vision like we humans do, and other primates and birds and many fish, is that it means that we can have very high visual acuity, and we can see in daytime extremely well. And in some cases with birds with very extremely good color vision, which is given to them because that means that they have a lot of cones in their retina as opposed to rods, which horses have more of. When you have a lot of cones, it means you can see very well during the day, but really poorly at night, which is why birds have to roost. So horses and other animals that live in similar environments and their predators have poorer color vision, but very good nighttime vision. And I remember as a child when I lived on King Island, galloping to the beach in the evening and home again, when I couldn't see hardly a thing. All I knew was to hang on when I vaguely saw in the shadow that there was a hedge coming up. We had to jump that and swerve hard left to avoid a wire fence and end up in our backyard. And the horses never seemed to make a mistake. So they have this extremely good all-round vision when it comes to nighttime and daytime vision. And as you can see with those two diagrams, their color is poorer, but also the breadth of their vision is much bigger because they have almost 350 degrees of vision. They also have an extra layer of cells on the retina called a tapetum, which reflects light. So that's why when you shine torches on foxes and other animals, which also have this tapetum, it increases the available light and reflects it backwards and forwards. Owls have the same thing, and that's why owls are one of the few birds that see extremely well at night, because they have this reflective membrane like a mirror inside the eye that enables them to see better because it increases the amount of light. So they have extremely good vision. We know that. So I'm talking about that because when it comes to communication, they can learn and uptake visual cues very well because they see well enough. When it comes to hearing, they also have extremely acute hearing, and their range is a bit different to ours. We hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. That's our general range for human beings. Horses hear from 50 hertz, so they don't hear as lower frequencies as we do, but they hear much higher frequencies, right up to 33.5 kilohertz. So there are things that we don't hear in the high frequency range that they do hear. That's the frequency. When we talk about loudness, we use the term decibels, and I'll mention that in a minute, but basically their funnel-shaped ears and their mobile ears enable them to locate sounds, and that also increases the amount of hearing decibels by anything from 10 to 20 decibels. So it's quite extraordinary. When you think about it, for example, 85 to 90 decibels is painful for humans and probably painful for horses. The human area of speech is around about 70, that's 65 is a quiet voice, 70 is getting louder, 75 is getting quite a lot louder, and above that can be quite painful for horses, and that's why speaking quietly around horses is a really important thing. The interesting aspect about their hearing, I think, is that anything above 2 kilohertz, the horses are not so good at localizing close noises, and that's why the snapping of twigs and the crackling of microphones can make them really flighty, because they can't localize it. Below that they can, but above it they can't. In terms of the back to frequency again, it's unusual for large animals like horses to hear at high frequencies. So horses are unusual in that area, and antelopes, I suspect, are the same. I haven't found any data on that. But again, because they're creatures of the open grassland, they need to be able to hear the high-pitched sounds, possibly because that indicates the creeping of a predator or something like that, crackling of the undergrowth and all of that sort of thing. So what really is disturbing to horses that we can't hear is more likely to be high-frequency sounds. Also, interestingly, in terms of cues, that we use voice cues, horses have the most sensitive hearing in the same areas that we do and within our human voice range. And that's why verbal cues can be very, very successful with horses. So it's worth thinking about that, because if we speak quietly to horses, they hear us, and it makes them more comfortable. And we need to understand that their acquisition of voice cues has to be via what we call classical conditioning. That means the voice cue should come first before any other kind of signal. For example, if we use lead rein pressure to lead the horse forward, we should give the voice cue first and say, walk on, and then give immediately after that the hand pressure from the lead rein. And of course, it's important to have those pressures reduced to very light pressures, but when they are, that's the ideal time for them to be able to acquire a voice cue, but it's got to come first. And that's what is interesting about classical conditioning. It's important that the new cue always comes first before any other cue, if we want to make it a cue. And finally, we need to think about, when we use voice cues, to emphasize the vowel sounds. So we might say, as good horse coaching was already done and pointed out for a long time, that when the horse is on the lunge, we would say trot instead of, or we could say trot, and that also emphasizes a vowel sound. But it's a good idea to elongate the vowel sounds and to make the consonants a little bit sharper. It is important that if we're going to use voice commands for horses for various things, even though it's not allowed in ridden dressage competitions, but nonetheless, it makes sense to use them, I think. If we're going to use them, we need to make sure that they're clear enough for horses, and that they are brief, and that they are very consistent, that we always use the same kind of voice cue for that. And incidentally, if we're going to reward horses by scratching, which is a million times more effective than patting, patting has to be learned. It's not natural for horses to respond to patting. It's very unnatural. But scratching at the base of the neck, when it comes to tactile sense, which I'm going to talk about shortly, scratching is a very good reward. And if we're going to use a voice command to herald that, and we say good, we can say good boy, but it doesn't really make much sense to say boy or girl, because then we've got to change. So we just say good and then scratch, and it makes a big difference to them if we can reward them in that way. And then the voice itself, as long as we're consistent and we always say the word before we do the scratching, soon the word takes on the properties of the scratching. And that's vital, because if we don't do it that way and we just say good boy every now and again, but we don't bother backing it up with scratching at the base of the neck, it ends up being white noise, and he doesn't hear it, and it makes no difference to his behavior. So in terms of communication, we really need to maximize the way we use our voice. And as I said, with visual signals, if we're going to use a visual signal, it's exactly the same thing. We use it through classical conditioning. So maybe we'll give a hand signal before we lead the horse forward, and that works fine too. But it's got to be very clear and consistent. We do need to recognize that horses have less ability to generalize than we do. And so if we're not specifically clear about our commands and cues, the horse won't adopt them, and it'll just habituate, because that's the kind of animal we have produced through selective breeding. And that is one that gets used to whatever we do, unless we make it really connected. And looking at smell, of course, we don't really use smell much in terms of communication, but horses do, and they have a very good sense of smell. In fact, one of the earliest veterinary texts that came about over 100 years ago misappropriated the horse's brain for its nasal passages, because the nasal tissue is it's so extensive compared to the smaller brain of the horse, which is something like the size of a mandarin. And the sense of smell, of course, is so important to animals like horses, which is partly why their noses or their heads are so long. And the Flehmen response, as you can see with this particular picture where the horse raises his lip, the reason they do that is to get a much more accurate picture of what is in the air through sampling. And in doing this, when they raise their lip, they shut their nasal passages off, they trap the air, they pressurize it a little bit. You can see the sides of the horse's nostrils flare up a bit when they're doing that. And in that moment, the air is warmed and the water vapor in the air connected with the molecules of whatever they're smelling condenses and falls onto this vomeronasal organ, otherwise known as Jacobson's organ. And this gives them a reading that's way more effective than normal smell. It's more like a mass spectrometer. It's very, very powerful. And it enables horses to get a very clear picture. And for example, stallions, it's part of sexual activity in stallions because it gives them a very clear picture by associative learning when mares are exactly in the right time of estrus. Also, people have developed equine appeasing pheromones, and these pheromones are made from, as they have been with dogs and cats, from the skin secretions of the mammary glands. And these are very non-volatile molecules, so they're oily molecules. And this equine appeasing pheromone is said to calm horses down. There does seem to be more evidence that it works well than the opposite, but still there needs to be more research in this particular area. I've used equine appeasing pheromones ever since they were first invented because Patrick Pagier, who first invented it in France, gave me some samples. And I saw some response to it, but I didn't see, for example, that it calmed horses in quite scary environments, for example, when they're traveling in a float or a trailer, as you call it, or I think it's a trailer, yeah. We call it a horse float in Australia. But regardless, I didn't see a particularly significant effect there. Now, touch. This is really the big one because this is the way we communicate with horses when we're riding, and we really take it for granted. We don't think to develop it as much as we possibly could, and it's really quite outstanding, the horse's sense of touch. What is also interesting is that Lydia Tong and her colleagues showed that horses and humans have the equivalent basic anatomical structures, in other words, nociceptors, to detect pain in the skin. So the pain feelings of horses appears, for all intents and purposes, to be exactly the same as humans. The amount of nociceptors and mechanoreceptors, which also are involved in pain, vary across the horse's body. So some areas have more and some areas have less. The important aspects of touch are not only in the way we deliver the aids when we ride, because the bit is attached to our hands, and at the other end of the reins is the horse's mouth. So the horse feels the bit, and the horse can learn to have very light slowing and stopping and turning responses. And that's all to do with how we use pressure release. So we need to really study that, I think, because it's the release of pressure that actually rewards the response. It's not the pressure itself. The pressure itself motivates the horse to avoid it. So the more we understand the very instant, and I'm talking in microseconds almost, that we release the pressure, the quicker the horse will take up the light aid. The more we subject the horse to strong pressures, the more he just habituates to it, because as I said, that's what we've bred them to do. So it's very important, and also from our leg pressures and even our seat pressures, that the horse can identify these through consistency of the human body. And that's why when we ride horses, we need to have really clear lessons on how we use our bodies, because it's all good and well to just talk about reins for slowing and legs for going, and these can translate to seat cues and other cues. But nonetheless, the only way we can possibly have our position being effective transducers of rein leg aids and seat aids is by consistency of our position. And that is difficult on a moving animal. And not only is it a moving animal, but also the way that the dynamics of the horse's back work. The horse's back not only goes forward and back as we walk, but it goes from side to side in a kind of oscillating movement. So it's really worth thinking about that. And I think for me, when I was first training horses, I learned a method called the Jeffrey method. It's an Australian method. An Australian guy came upon it, and it's basically training the horse bareback before you ever put a saddle on, which is a wonderful thing, because I still do it that way and encourage people to do it in the start, because there's much less problems than when you put a girth on, because a girth is a pressure that never goes away. But what is interesting about when you ride a horse bareback is that you feel what the back does. And most people only ever feel what they feel through multitude padding and saddle trees and even air or flock. And that really dilutes what you feel through your seat and what you can really know about what the horse's back does. So I think it's so valuable, if you have a quiet horse, to feel what the back does, not only when you ride in different gaits, but when you ride in different shapes, for example, when you're turning. And finally, this leads to attachment. I have mentioned the importance of touch to horses, but it goes right through to the need of the horse for, as a social species, to socialize. And they really do need that. It's not just something they want, they really need it. I would say horses are hypersocial, just like humans. And the reason I say that is because there are no other animals that I know of, and I've been studying this as not only as a cognitive scientist, but as a zoologist as well. There are few other animals where touch is more important than it is with horses. There are some where it's as important, but there are many where it's more visual. But for a horse, it's visual and touch, and they really thrive on touch. And so we could presume that in many respects, they're so much like us that when we are socially isolated, that is very deleterious for humans, as indeed it would be for horses. And that's why horses, when we scratch them at the base of the neck, do show, and there are many experiments that show this very clearly now, so it's a given, that we can reduce their heart rate by up to 10 beats per minute when the heart rate is raised above baseline. And that's partly because horses, unlike other animals, have a plexus of nerves in the front of the withers. And how ideal is that? And how lucky is that we happen to have this animal that, with this plexus of nerve in front of the withers, that directly connects to the vagus nerve that modulates the heart rate. So never forget that. And that's why patting is nowhere near as relevant as rubbing and scratching the horse. And you'll see the difference. And if the horse seems to not like it, because that's not only unusual, that's it's wrong. It's no wild horse has ever liked that. It's some product of our making. So we can actually reattach them, as I would call it, by scratching the horse that doesn't like it at all or much, by continuously doing it until they start to show an affiliative response. That is, they start to look to you and want to scratch you back. And the more you practice that, the better they become. And I think it's a really valuable thing for horses that are very insecure and for horses that have been isolated. And the way we wean them is also a major problem for attachment. So I think that's something we really need to think about. So just looking at attachment, as I mentioned, touch is so vital for horses. The more they're stressed and isolated, the stronger their need to groom each other, and they do it more and more when they're stressed. And I used to notice this when I ran the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre. We had a very high caseload of problematic horses, as well as young horses that we were training in foundation training. But when we saw these horses that were very insecure, we would see that when they're released into a paddock with another paddock mate, that they would scratch much more vigorously and more frequently than horses normally did. In other words, they're reattaching. Touch, like it does in humans, produces oxytocin and endorphins. And oxytocin is the most amazing love chemical and attachment chemical. Kirsten Uvnes-Moberg has written a wonderful book called The Oxytocin Factor that I think every horse rider should read, because it shows how incredible oxytocin is and what happens when you don't have enough of it. Certain authors have even used the term touch hunger, that when animals are isolated and deprived of touch, that they're touch hungry. For humans, isolation is the single most important predominant factor in all mental disorders, and I mean all mental disorders. So we need to seriously think about how we house horses. You know, we have all of these terms that we use, euphemisms, you know, for a cage or a prison. We call it a stable, and maybe the horse is happy to be in it, because many times I know from my own experience, you leave the stable door open into the horse's yard or paddock and he will go into the stable. So it's not like they don't necessarily like it, but when they're free to choose, and especially with a normal horse, and I don't mean a horse that's insecure and detached through bad treatment or wrong treatment, I mean just in general, they will just choose it and then move out of it. And I think we need to recognize that when we lock horses up, it's quite problematic because they cannot touch each other. So for me, the only solution for good mental health is group housing, where we can have the horse at least in with another horse. And if we have stabling, to pull down those walls, those bars, maybe not the walls, just the bars, and allow them to touch each other, as indeed they have done with the Manchester Mounted Police, with very good effect, where they showed the horses are much braver after that. So I think it's important to recognize this, because if we keep avoiding this question about the horse's socialization, all we're doing is pretending the horse is something that it is not. Okay. The question then is, what is the best cue we should use? Should we be using voice cues? Should we be using tactile cues? Should we be using visual cues for horses? And the answer is, we just don't know. This is one area of research that really needs to be done. It's been shown a little bit with other species, and what it has been shown is that the cues that are salient to the animal not only varies a great deal between species, but it's also a result of the species' evolved adaptations to their respective niches. So, for example, animals like birds would be much more cued to a visual cue, because they're by and large more visual, and less and touch would be much less salient. Social animals would be generally more cued by touch, especially if they are animals that reconnect by touch. It's been shown with rats that they can learn the association between the taste and their own illness, but they're much slower to learn predictive cues of that illness. So, for example, if you use a light or a tone of some taste that predicts nausea, they're much slower to acquire that, but they're very quick, which is why rats are hard to poison, because they quickly learn it. And not only do they learn it, but they can even pass it on to others in their nest when they're ill. So it's a very interesting thing. But from my point of view, I would really love to see more research in this area of salience. But nonetheless, I think we're pretty much onto the right thing, because, you know, humans have been with horses for 5,000 or 6,000 years, and we do know that touch is an important salient cue for horses. And we also realize that, unfortunately, because we've bred horses to pull battle wagons and gun carriages and cannons and carts and all sorts of things, because we've bred horses as hauling animals, we've also selectively bred horses to be less sensitive from touch in some areas of their body. Because, for example, if they were very sensitive around their shoulders, they would never pull anything. So we've bred those horses to have less sensitivity in certain areas, and sometimes throughout the entire body. And this is a problem with many performance horses, is that when we, even when we breed them back with more sensitive animals like thoroughbred and Arab, sometimes the loss of sensitivity or the lack of sensitivity comes up, and the horse then looks like it's lazy. And lazy is another anthropomorphic term that people use to describe horses that are less motivated by tactile pressure. And that's a pity, because that doesn't mean they don't suffer from it. That means they don't develop learned helplessness from it. It just means that they're less motivated to move from it. I'd noticed that when I was doing my PhD, that those horses that seemed to be like that, and people would call them dumb bloods, you know, they're warm bloods, that because they were slower to learn from pressure compared to a thoroughbred. I noticed that when I was doing a behavior tests using food rewards, that those same horses were extremely fast to catch on to any outcome that resulted in food. So intelligence is very much a question of motivation, and it's important to remember that one. Okay, so now I want to move into the area of the horse's telos. And telos is an ancient Greek word, but it's a very appropriate word to describe the wiring of the horse. You know, it's sort of neuroarchitecture, as we sometimes call it. We often use the term ethogram too, but an ethogram is really more of a described catalogue of behaviours that humans have seen in horses. And I think telos is much more appropriate, because it's actually about the horse itself. And I used to use the term ethogram some time ago, but I've moved into this area of now using the word telos, because I think it describes much better the horse's natural wiring and what we find with horses after so many years of selective breeding. So this is the wiring of the horse. So I really need to talk about the horse's mental abilities. And when I selected this picture, I was only on closer inspection, I realized that it's actually, the text is in French, but it's the same. Luckily, the language of science is pretty much the same everywhere. The most important difference between our brains and the horses is that we have this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the top part, the dark blue area at the front of our brains. And the area at the back, at the bottom, the cerebellum that's painted brown or red, is really about muscular coordination, but it's also involved in learning. It's involved in the acquisition of cues, and it's involved in many areas of classical conditioning. But getting back to this prefrontal cortex, and in particular the dorsolateral part, in humans, it's very, very dense and granular tissue. And it's the reason it's granular is because it is highly nucleated. In other words, the nucleus of the cell is a really large part. And that just means they're extremely active. When the bigger the nucleus, the more active they are. They do a lot, and they use a lot of fuel. They use glucose. And for that reason, it's very expensive to be a human being, which is why we eat so much compared to other animals in terms of the relative body weight. So when we can, as humans, we can possibly afford to do that. And when I say that, of course, I have to recognize that a vast number of humans on the planet don't have enough to eat. and even there are millions of children who are suffering from malnutrition, which many of us in the West are simply blind to as we pursue our routines and causes. But this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, what it does is it's really the basic side of metacognitive tasks. And what that means is it enables us to plan ahead. And that's really something, you know, when you can think in your mind's eye, you can shut your eyes and think, what are you going to do next? And it enables us to have a rich imagination, to estimate time. And even those of you who know that, you know, when you have children, grandchildren, that even estimating time is very difficult for children of certain ages. It doesn't really become established until they're quite a lot older. So it's a very complicated thing to understand the passage of time. And that includes the future as well as the past. And that also enables further aspects of abstract thought. And the reason I'm saying that is because we must respect the fact that if an animal doesn't have that same dorsolateral prefrontal cortical tissue, that it's going to be much more stimulus bound, which is what we find with horses. And in fact, in humans, our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is absolutely unique, the extent of it, compared to other animals, which is it's been maybe a blessing because it's enabled us to eke out an incredible existence and become a very numerous species. But of course, as we see with climate change, it's also devastating for the planet. And there is no more relevant time to talk about that than now. So when we talk about animals being stimulus bound like horses, what I'm really referring to is that they are very much in this place at this moment. And that's why when we do what we do with horses, even when we do it badly and the horse suffers during training, when people do things wrongly and do bad things to horses and cause all sorts of insufferable things, that when you turn the horse back into the paddock, it's a new moment. And the horse may even be easy enough to catch. And it looks like he's fine with this training. And that's the problem, because we put on horses a human veil of cognition as if they're fine with whatever we do. Then the proof of it is that they're pretty much happy to be caught and pretty much happy to be saddled up. It's not like they're being saddled up and thinking, oh my God, what's coming next? But when something is coming next, whatever it is, and it happens, then it is just as bad for horses as it would be for humans. And we need to think about that, because as we move into this new space in this millennium, we've got to start thinking ahead, and we've got to shed ourselves a lot of those traditional ways of thinking, and we've got to think about how we might tackle our relationships with horses in the future. And it may look very different. And horse sports indeed are at the forefront of this particular topic. Horse sports may look very different in the future because of social license to operate. It doesn't really matter what you and I think too much, or what I think and other scientists. What really matters is the public perception of what they see, and their expectation of good welfare, and their reassessment of practices. So let's have a look at this anthropomorphic element, and we look at communication, because that's really the focus of this particular talk. Human communication is quite different to most communication. When you think about it, we all speak different languages, and so if I speak English, I'm not going to be understood by somebody who speaks all of the other languages at all. And yet when a horse whinnies, a horse in Australia will pretty much know what a horse in Russia is whinnying about. So our language involves complex phonemes and also syntax, and the way we arrange it that includes, future and conditional aspects of tenses. And these are all symbolic, and that's what words are. They're really symbols, and we acquire them through classical conditioning, and that's how we train our children. We point to the cup and we say cup, and the more we do that, the more the child learns that that's what it is. And those elements of classical conditioning horses can learn too, those mere things. But when we start putting them into sentences that have meanings and have subjects and objects and all of those sorts of things, then it becomes more complex. These expressions that animals have, we call phatic expressions, and they're universal. The universe, between species, so within species, I should say. So in humans, the universal elements, the phatic expressions that we have are things like laughing and crying and screaming, and they're similar to other animal communications. Anyone knows when we laugh in any other country, well, how we feel, or if we cry or we scream or we're angry, and all of those sorts of things. So let's take a look at non-human communication systems, because they're based on one of 4 models. And so one of them is a very finite repertory of calls, and that's pretty much describes horses and many other animals, or a continuous analog system that registers magnitude, and insects are amazing how they've evolved those sorts of systems. And bees are a very good example in their system of communication through their waggle dances, in terms of being able to communicate to other bees where the nectar is. And also the way bees go about finding nectar, it's different to a hummingbird, which is much more complex. Bees have a very clear analog system of sampling and ensuring that a plant is sufficiently sampled all throughout all the flowers, whereas with hummingbirds it's quite different. But anyway, I won't get onto that. The third one is a series of random variations on a theme, which is very typical of bird calls, where they vary very much their calls, and it can be even within certain areas. It can be like a local culture, and there are quite a lot of individual variations of those themes and those calls, and that's why it's got a massive amount of flexibility. And we can even teach ravens and parrots to make human sounds, to speak, to say words. And that's also given us an ability with some animals like parrots, which are extremely intelligent, that we should never underestimate the intelligence of a parrot or a raven, because there's been quite a lot of interesting experiments with an African grey parrot called Alex, where this parrot can even say what it wants for breakfast, if it wants an orange or whatever else. So birds are pretty interesting in terms of their intelligence, and their brain structure is completely different to that of a mammal, because they evolved from a different reptile series. And then the fourth one is encultured communication, and that's more complex communication, where a few species, particularly the toothed whales and the great apes, have a very plastic and dynamic communication system that can be specific to an entire group. So orcas, for example, have certain calls. They give social communications to other orcas that may be specific to orcas in one particular area of the world. So we see that it's quite different, but with humans, it's a different system altogether. Another area I wanted to talk about, which is really fascinating, is the work of Helen Keller, and she was able to write in the end. She was born deaf and blind and therefore couldn't speak. And at the age of 11, she had a pretty amazing teacher. And Helen was an extremely intelligent person, but she was just unable to communicate. And I think what she had written is really very interesting. It tells us a lot about how we presume so much about intelligence and about the use of language and how language informs intelligence. Because she says, "Before my teacher came to me, I didn't know that I am. I lived in a world that was no world. I cannot hope to describe adequately that unconscious yet conscious time of nothingness. I did not know that I knew aught, or that I lived or acted or desired. I had neither will nor intellect. I was carried along to objects and acts by a certain blind impetus. I can remember all this, not because I knew that it was so, but because I have tactual memory. It enables me to remember that I had never contracted my forehead in the act of thinking. I never viewed anything beforehand or even chose it. I also recall tactually the fact that never in the start of the body or a heartbeat did I feel that I loved or cared for anything. My inner life then was a blank without past, present, or future, without hope or anticipation. And later, when I first learned the meaning of I and me, and that I was something, then consciousness first existed for me. Now that sounds like a pretty bleak view of the world without the abilities to see or hear. But I think what it tells us is that at that point in her time, in her life, she was very stimulus bound. She could move or act through what she called blind impetus. But we shouldn't expect that she then could imagine ahead or before, because that's what she's saying. So I think this informs us a lot about horses, and why we need to think of it like that is that we need to understand them extremely accurately in order to communicate with them well. So what does it matter? Does it really matter if whether we understand horse cognition or not? Well, many people talk about horses being clever or smart or dumb or mean or whatever. What is intelligence? I remember when I was first studying my PhD and I talked about intelligence in animals, and you might notice I don't use the word intelligence when it comes to horses and say that they're less intelligent because they don't have a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, because in many ways they're more intelligent because they're very good at classical conditioning and they have such a profound memory that's better than ours, most likely, especially their immediate photographic type memory. You know, an ant is intelligent at being an ant. A worm is intelligent at being a worm. Intelligence is very much about the neural hardwiring you have, your telos, to eke out the resources in your environment to an optimal level. So we see in horses that there are all sorts of narratives about the horse. And I'm saying this now in terms of reflection on what I have just said about all the senses and the horse's mental abilities. You know, we talk about the horse being loyal. Is it really? And willing. Is it really? It seems that way, but what is willingness? Why would an animal be willing to please a human? Why are we so special? That sounds sort of like a quasi almost religious point of view, that the horse is put on the earth for our purpose. Whereas a more zoological and prosaic approach would say that the horse is what it is, and it has these particular capacities that we've been able to hijack. People talk about the horse's work ethic, but more recently, when horses have been used in sport, which has created all sorts of problems for the horse, and particularly in its welfare, the sort of narrative is that the horse, as an athlete, that we develop a partnership with a horse, that the horse loves to win, and we make a connection. And these things we need to question as well. Is the horse really an athlete? What kind of an athlete can you, or partner in a sport, can you whip or kick or make it do something? You know, what kind of a teammate would you do that to in a sport? So we really need to question those things. And possibly it sounds really pretty, I guess, dire for me to say that it's possibly more likely that the horse is a living piece of sport equipment. And if we use horses for sport, we need to be comfortable with that. And I did use horses in sport. I think it's something that is a question we need to be comfortable with. Maybe one of our justifications might be that if we do it well, according to the horse's welfare, because the horse is stimulus bound, he lives in this world. And if we do it well, that is his world. He doesn't reflect on it necessarily And I think that is most likely to be true, but we need to do it well. So whatever we think about the future of horse sports, we've got to be thinking ahead. And that's where I think I'm very critical of the FEI. I don't think it thinks ahead. I think it just does damage control. And the Titanic has a lot of holes in it. And the deck chairs are already sinking. So we need to be looking ahead at how we would operate in horse sports. For example, in modern pentathlon, horses are not going to be used anymore. How do we do this? How do we frame the rules that are for the horse's welfare? Why did the FEI disband the welfare subcommittee when the subject of roll cur came about? And I was an active scientist at that time, and I even gave a talk at the FEI about roll cur and hyperflexion and the likely damage it can do to horses. And instead, the reaction was, let's talk about the horse that's where the term equine athlete came about. And instead of increasing the welfare subcommittee to give the horse an actual committee for its welfare, they disbanded it altogether. So it really is a crying shame, and it needs something that has to be done about it. And regardless of what I say, if people don't look ahead and they just keep looking to the stern of the ship, they will not even notice that it's sunk until it's too late, and then everybody will be screaming out. So I think we need to be thinking very much about the future and doing the best we can for horses. When it comes to understanding the communication between ourselves and horses, there are just two major elements that animal psychology and behavioral psychology implore us to think about, and that is predictability and controllability. Predictability is all about the signals that produce responses. So it's very much about classical conditioning. You know, the horse puts its ears back before it bites, and the horses very quickly learn that when you see another horse with its ears back, that there's trouble on the horizon. So they're very good at acquiring cues, and all animals are like that. There's barely an animal that I can think of. In fact, I think it would be maladaptive for an animal not to have the ability to learn cues that are relevant to its environment. Controllability is really all about the choices that the animal has. And don't forget, we can arrange these choices through training, and that's what we do. But it's all about the consistency and the absolute reliability of those responses to those stimuli. And that's why they've got to be. And that's why the aids that we give to horses must be easily discriminated. They've got to be simple. When we start using complex language that many people find it hard to understand and get their head around and only pretend to understand, for example, terms like inside leg to outside rein, when we think about those terms, imagine if we don't know exactly what we're doing, how on earth does the horse know? And all we do is enable him to lose his sense of controllability and therefore become more insecure. Predictability and controllability rely on our proper reinforcement using the correct use of positive and negative reinforcement in training and the avoidance of punishment. The problem with punishment is that it's a very unreliable tool. There's no clear dial on it. You know, how much is too much and what is effective. It's often done way after the act. It's true that I know of horses in recent Olympic Games that were deprived of water because they did a bad dressage test. And I've heard many times of horses being punished after a bad show jumping around. These sorts of things have got to stop. This is just ridiculous. And I think horse people really need to learn about learning theory and how it works and be very good at it, because how the world works up to the present moment is we rely on good trainers to teach us, but good trainers don't always exactly know what they're doing because they're so automatic in what they do. They're unconsciously aware. So they're unconscious about their training. They're unconsciously competent. So we really should learn about this. And I think that in the future, people will need to do courses, at least some have some understanding of learning theory. And the advantage of that is that it will just enable them to do it better. I mean, it's like if you stop people being engineers, you're not going to be able to produce any better vehicles. It's engineers that develop the vehicles and mechanics look after them. But we need engineers in this sense too, to understand how the horse works. And we can all be engineers, and the more engineering knowledge we have, the better. So those areas are essential in terms of predictability and controllability. So when we look at this diagram, I developed this so that we understand how negative reinforcement can lead to the wrong behavior, which is bad for the horse as well as bad for us as humans. And that's the red area on the outside. So the negative reinforcement in the white center is the bit that is the fundamental aspect of the operant conditioning. That's negative reinforcement, the removal of something aversive that strengthens an existing behavior. And so let's say we want to do something, that's the blue area. And if we do it well, that's the green area. If we do it badly, that's the red area, as I said. So we want to touch the horse's legs with our hands, and the horse is not familiar with us. If the horse moves its leg and we move our hand because it moves its leg, the horse will learn to move its leg and therefore remove our hand. So if we understand about training, we would actually keep our hand there. And many good horsemen have known that for a long time. Many farriers know that you try to keep your hand on the horse's leg and then you remove it when he's still, because you reinforce stillness. And the same thing is true for all of these areas. We want the horse to go forward. We've got to remove the legs pressure when he goes forward. If we don't, we end up with a lazy horse or other problems that can come from that too. Our slowing aids, we need to make sure that they're softened when the horse gives the right response. And if we don't do that, we can create a really hot horse. We need to teach the horse to turn his forequarters independently from his hindquarters. In many horse sports, we have to have these separately where we can do that, particularly dressage, where we turn the forequarters independently of the hindquarters. And when we do them together, that's a half pass. But we need to recognize that many of these movements are consecutive movements. In other words, they're consecutive elements of single learned responses that we train the horse to do. Stop, including slowing, shortening, down a gait. Go, including faster, up a gait, longer. Turn, including direct turn plus indirect turn when the rein comes towards the neck. And leg yield. So there are 10 of them. Even when it comes to catching the horse, it's very important that we do that well. And there's a real art to that. If the horse runs away, you should stop approaching it and turn your back immediately when it runs away and walk away. And if you do that approach retreat technique, you can train a horse that's more difficult to catch to be caught. And even true for going into the trailer, when we, if we use any lead rein pressure for the horse to go into the trailer, if the horse balks and we release the pressure, the horse learns that balking is the way the head pressure gets removed. And so the art of it is in the early training of the horse, where we never have to use strong pressures. The problem with retraining is that horses have been so messed up that retrainers are often obliged to use stronger pressure, whereas in fact there are many other ways to do things to resolve problems as well, as we know nowadays. But nonetheless, if we trained all horses well, we wouldn't have these problem horses that show up in the vast numbers that they do. And head shyness is another very good example as well. We remove our hand when the horse is head shy, the horse learns to be head shy. If we keep our hand on the horse's head and then remove it when he's still, he learns not to be head shy. So doing that well is a very important thing. So as we move now towards the end, I also wanted to just talk about arousal, because arousal levels are very important and very pertinent at this time in equitation science research. If we look at Panskep's basic 7 arousal systems as broad descriptions of the various motivational drives in animals, we can see that there are, there's a drive for seeking and for, the things that an animal wants, for lust, the drive for caring, the drive for play, of rage, of fear and grief, all of those things. And one of the criticisms of Panskep's systems is that there's no direct, no clear neurological wiring for the separation of all of these systems, but they do provide a basic template of understanding these systems, and I think that's what's important. But the thing is, these are all oscillating at any one moment. It's unlikely that it would be just one of these that's moving at any one moment in any animal and the others are all dormant. It's very unlikely. So when we look at the various forms of arousal, we need to consider those in terms of training, because it's the interaction of these that give the horse confidence or reduce confidence. So we've got to take care of them. And I think a more modern understanding of the interaction of these systems in terms of the vagus nerve that operates the heart will give us a future understanding, a deeper understanding of how these actually work and how they interact. But what we know now is that there are interactions between these things, and we need to recognize them. So an example might be you have a stallion, you want to load him into a trailer, but there's a mare in season and he's also fearful of the trailer. He has quite a few systems going on at the same time, and which ones are going to win out. So we need to arrange our training in a way that reduces the competition between these areas. And that means seeking generally low arousal and I don't mean sleepiness, but just low levels of arousal in an appropriate environment that enables us to train him effectively. Affective states are very important too, and this is my final slide. When we look at affective states, basically affective states imply pessimism or optimism. And although that sounds a little bit anthropomorphic, what pessimism and optimism mean in terms of behavioral science and a stimulus-bound animal is it basically means that the animal, or the horse in this case, is going to be motivated to give a response or not when we train a new signal. So when we are training something new, if the horse is in an optimistic state, he's going to try something new. If he's in a pessimistic state, he's not going to try, because nothing ever worked in the past. The pressures never went away, and therefore what's the point? So that's how the horse sees it at a very subconscious level. It's probably most likely not conscious at all. It's subconscious, as indeed it is in humans too. These affective states are very much subconscious. These affective states arise at the lower part, principally in the orbitofrontal prefrontal cortex. So just below the area, or well below the area of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but in the prefrontal cortical area, that's where negative affective states. And horses have quite well-wired neurological pathways there. And that's because they're very emotional animals. And that's also because they make connections with each other, because they're very social animals. So how do we arrange these positive states to enable horses to connect with us? Well, first of all, we've got to make sure he's in good health. And that's where vets come into it, and nutritionists. All of that needs to be well accounted for. We need to provide clear, consistent communication. And apart from the things I've already mentioned, that's where body language makes a really big difference. And I meant to talk about that when I talked about visual stimuli, but my apologies, I forgot, because it is profoundly important how we move around horses. And that's why the best horse trainers in the world, regardless of whether you like them or you don't, if you look at the way the good ones do move, and I don't mean necessarily the greatest riders, I mean the greatest horse people, that they move around horses in a very fluid, quiet way that's non-aggressive, maybe a little round-shouldered, and all their movements are very smooth and non-threatening. And the same with the way they use their voice, not too loud voices and smooth voice. So that's really important. And the other aspect of clear, consistent communication is the way we use our aids and the understanding of how we use positive and negative reinforcement and reinforcing the correct behaviors. That's fundamental to producing positive states, because we've got to put the horse in a position where he's really optimistic about what we might, what challenge and question we might have for him. He's a social animal, as I mentioned at length, but I really feel I can never go on about that long enough. As a social animal, he needs extensive abilities to not only see other animals, but to touch them. And that's why, to me, it's really quite ridiculous that, we spend all this time making stables with fancy gold knobs and spending fortune on stables. From a very human point of view, that's great. But from a horse point of view, it doesn't matter one bit. What really matters is, has he got any mates there? And if we could just make a gap between the bars of the stables, between horses, we would see a big difference. Even where the horse is still able, of course, to be alone if he wants to, but he has the freedom of choice to engage in socialization, we would see not only differences in the horse's general behavior, but in their training behavior too. We would see braver horses. We would see less shying, less neophobia. Enabling extensive foraging too, because that's a basic hardwired drive. The horse has evolved to eat high fiber roughage for 13 odd hours a day, and that means he needs to keep munching. And that's where high fiber is very important. And we need to think of that constant supply and enable it as much as we can. Maybe in racing that may be difficult, but we need to figure out how we're going to enable horses to access it, because the more we withhold it, the more insecure we make horses, and that sets up problems for them, and it sets up big obstacles for training outcomes as well. So this is as much about training efficiency as anything. And finally, exercise. We need to give them as much exercise as we can. Normally they will do between 7 and 17 kilometers a day in nature, and they're wired for that. And because they have this wiring for all of these 5 things in the bullet points, we have to access them, because these are not something the horse just wants. They are something he needs. And so by doing this, we build resilience through predictability and reward. We make the horse resilient about things that are unpredictable in his world. He becomes a bit more immune to the sudden events that he might find aversive, because we've built up this really strong armor of immunizing him against these problems by enabling to access these 5 areas: good health, clear, consistent communication, socialization, extensive foraging, and exercise. And if we do those things, we have a happy horse, and we have a horse that can be in the best state, and we can feel that when we are interacting with horses that we are doing it in the most optimal way. So thank you very much. I meant to go for 50 minutes. I'm a bit longer, but we've still got plenty of time for questions. So I'm happy to take them. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in any of our courses, we have nationally Australian accredited courses, Diploma of Equitation Science. We have many. I think we have 50% of our students are international. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Andrew. That's fantastic. Thank you. So much information. It's just incredible. And we've got a fair few questions, so I'm going to, we may not be able to get through all of them, but I will start and we will do our best. So first of all, Jen's asked, actually a comment first of all. Firstly, I wanted to thank Dr. McLean for being responsible for one of two light bulb moments in my life. The first one was discovering classical equitation, and the second one was finding Dr. McLean in equine science. Oh, amazing. I continue to be inspired by you. Thank you. So I'd like to ask you, who or what inspires or has inspired you?
Well, gee, it's really difficult for me because, you know, I'm fundamentally a zoologist, and the reason I am is because I'm really, I have a great love for animals and natural systems. So many people have inspired me. I think in the horse training world, I was inspired by an old trainer from Australia called Tom Roberts. He was deeply inspirational for me. He wrote quite a few books, and I've even written a book about his life, and pointed out how closely aligned his work was with principles of equitation science that we seem to have discovered only recently. So he was a great motivator. David Attenborough is really, you know, I think my whole family is so sick and tired of me watching the same things over and over. I've seen every single thing he's ever produced, and I watch it time and again. And I think he's the most wonderful purveyor of natural science. So I think he's certainly a great motivator for me. And in the horse world, I would say in the riding world, Rainer Klimke was definitely a great idol for me. And even more modernly, probably not much difference in age, but Kira Kirkland has been also a strong influence in the way she made it very pedestrian to people how to train horses in, and she was very clear, and for her it had to be very logical. So she was quite inspiring too.
That's wonderful. Heidi's done the Zoom mute thing. Zoom mute. We get somebody every time.
Oh, I did it. I was going so well with this question. Claire asked, I worked through your book with amazing results. I now always scratch and never pat. But as my horse can be quite anxious and spooky, I scratch lots and regularly as we ride out. But can I do it too much? Will he be habituated and no longer feel the calming effect? Fab question.
Great question.
It is a great question. The thing is about that kind of thing. No, you can't, because you can't do it too much, because it is a natural reaction. So you can't deplete it. You can, I mean, may get to the point where it doesn't mean so much. And I often think about that, you know, when you have a dog, and the same with children, they'll come for a cuddle, and you know, you give them a lot of attention, but then they've had enough and they're ready to move on. You know, in attachment theory, we call that a safe haven, and they see you as a secure place from which to explore the world. So I think you can't really do it too much. If you do it, it may just at that moment have less importance, but it's you never extinguish the need for it. When I talk about patting, you could actually train patting if you, by classical conditioning, if you patted the horse and then scratched, because by association it would work. But it seems to me a pointless thing to do. And I think the only reason we pat is because it's a primate thing to do. If you go to the zoo and you watch chimps, they pat each other on the head. So doubtless we've been doing it for 5 million years. It's time we stopped.
Yeah. And Claire has another great question, actually. She's on fire tonight. So looking ahead into a better future for horses, if you could choose one single change, this is going to be difficult, one single change in horse handling, what would it be?
I think socialization. I think too many horses are isolated, and we don't respect we know how damaging it is to be isolated as a human being. We know the effects of solitary confinement and how it has resulted in severe mental retardation and even convulsions, and people are never the same again. And little babies, if they don't get touched, there's a horrible set of black and white videos by a guy called René Spitz, S-P-I-T-Z, I think every horse person should look this up on YouTube and see what Renee Spitz showed with children, that when you don't touch them, after 6 months, they are unable to function ever again as a normal human being. So we need to think of what damage we do by disabling horses from touching each other. So socialization, I'd love to say two things and say, good, take on learning theory and learn about how horses learn, and socialization. Those two things, I would rest easy and retire.
Thank you. And there was some really sad and footage years ago, wasn't there, of orphanages where children weren't touched, and I think that's where some of that
in
that work was done.
Regime in Romania,
Right.
Horrible.
We've got two questions that are related, so I'll ask them together, about stable socialization. So one is that what many horse owners don't have the option to have horse-friendly stables due to the livery yard where they keep the horses. How can they optimize the welfare of their horse's mental health? And then another question about what the gap should be through if they have got bars. So let's start with how else can we optimize their mental health?
I think it's very difficult when you're in livery situations that you can't, often it's not possible to convince the owners and operators, but owners and operators really need to get this in their head, that it's really important. As I mentioned in one other presentation this year, and dressage judges have a lot to answer for too, in that, not that they would say it necessarily, but I think I would mark a horse more highly if it was covered in bite marks all up its neck than if it had a shiny, clear skin and you know it's been isolated in a stable, because horses do that. If you look at the horses in the Oosterwaarderplas and in Netherlands, where they've reclaimed land and have these conic horses in the wild, many of them, especially in breeding season, are covered in bite marks, and that's just what horses do. It's not necessarily a bad sign at all. But we value, like we do with fruit, we value just perfect skin, and it's a really ethically unsound thing to do if it could mean that the horse is isolated. So I think that's one thing, is to try and convince the owners to do it. Otherwise, try and give your horse as much outings as you can where he can. I mean, the more access you can give him socially, the better. And the other part of the question was what I've forgotten.
Sorry, yes. What gap should be between the bars? So is it just enough to touch noses or the whole head to go through?
Yeah. Oh, I think the whole head. I think, like weaving bars, I can't see the problem if you had an area of half of the width of the stable that enable the horse to make a choice to go and touch each other, and both would. And I think it's such an important thing. And to me, if the horse doesn't want to do it at all and he is really isolated, that's telling you there's something very messed up about that horse, because that is not how they are in nature. No horse is isolated. There's no such thing as a loner in nature, because loners got eaten thousands of years ago. Horses are group animals. So we need to think about that. And I think it's true that if we can't have access to another horse, another animal does seem to have some effect. They can't necessarily groom a sheep. But I know that I was involved with doing some work locally with a local pound where they kept horses that were, rescued, and the horse had a goat. And when the goat was removed and the horse was isolated, the horse went crazy for a week. They said that it does make a difference to have some company, but I just think it's about levels. If you can't see any other horse at all, or hear or smell them, that's really bad welfare. If you can at least know they're nearby but not see them, I guess that's slightly better. If you can see them, that's slightly better again. And if you can see and touch and everything, that's the gold standard. And why we're so afraid of that, it's just tradition. It's just really ridiculous. It's insane. So I think open up the bars, get the saw out, cut the bars out and see what you get. And don't worry about if you get a bite mark. The worst that ever happens is in the first week. And then after that, it's all solved. And I know that from the experience we've had with other horses now.
Yeah, they settle down. We've got a question here from Charlotte, who's up in Scotland. Any suggestions on how to help a young horse, 6, who doesn't like travelling or getting shod? She's a fidget, kicks out, gets upset. So for shoeing, we have to sedate, and for travelling, I have to take a chum, which helps out, a little Highland pony. She's testing the boundaries at the moment, but responding well to gentle firmness. I'm thinking gentle graded exposure on this will help. Short local solo journeys or longer with her field mate. Otherwise, may need to save for a lorry, which is tricky. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think having a paddock mate is always a good thing. I think that's the same thing when you have a horse in an arena. And I know as a clinician that I've made so many mistakes in the past, and that's where I've learned to get better because of the heavy criticism I've been under, which I always think is a positive thing for change. Where I would try and work with a horse was alone, but bring another horse in, or bring the horse that's in the arena outside. So that's the same with traveling. If you can bring another horse, well, that's really good and well, but there's another way of doing it, and that is Daniel Mills, professor at Lincoln University in the UK. He showed that 77% of issues of horses being isolated in stables were reduced through the access to a mirror. If a horse can see another horse, it does make them much happy, but of course they can't touch. But at least if they can see another horse, that can certainly help. Another one, of course, that I would say is if the horse is a bit nervous in the float, I would definitely look at the training of the horse and the reinforcement history, and train it to be comfortable in the float. So you could actually clicker train them in the float, target train them, and teach them that the float's a really good. So that do you call it a float? I've forgotten.
Trailer. Yeah.
Trailer. That the trailer is a really good place to be. That's really useful. And take the horse also on some long trips. Like, for example, with humans, when you do exposure therapy, it works better after 90 minutes of exposure. So I think a long trip can really make a big difference than a short trip. And that's partly because of the long half-life of cortisol, I expect, and the very short half-life of adrenaline. So I think leave them in the float for some time and feed them in the float. Make the float a really nice place to be. That's really that, and reassess the training. And the other thing about the legs, a lot of horses are hypersensitive. The legs, use hosing. Hosing's fantastic because you can keep the hose on the leg, and if the leg moves and fidgets and kicks, just keep moving the hose on the horse's leg. But as soon as the horses still take the hose off, and then start increasing the pressure of the hose, so it's more like a hand. And you usually find that on a wet leg after hosing, you can touch the leg because he's already, the pressure threshold, the pressure spectrum's already been invaded by the hose. And so now the sort of sound bite and the feel bite, if you might call it that, is altered. And you can usually pick the leg up and hold it. And then when you do, make sure you let it go before he intends or she intends to release the leg. But if the horse is moving, try and hold it for a fraction of a second longer. Then you be the one to decide to let the leg go, because through that release of that reinforcement, it trains us to be sensitive or not.
Brilliant, thank you. One last question from Helen. Is turnout with just one other horse enough for socialisation? I'd ask the same one, mine are in a pair.
Look, this is purely speculative. I was fortunate enough to be the PhD opponent for Elke Hartmann when she did a PhD on socialisation. And one of the things that she showed is that when you want to introduce a horse to a new horse, you've only got to have them in the yard beside another horse for half an hour, touching each other, and they're much less likely to do damage. So that's not long. It doesn't, it's easy. And of course, in a stable, it's easy. And I've forgotten the question again.
Is having two horses turned out together enough for socialisation?
Yes, it's not because I'm getting old, I don't think. I've always been like that. I think one horse is, the bucket is nearly full in terms of security. It is more ideal if the horse had access to a total cohort of ages like they would in the wild, but I think I think that is optimal, but you can bring the security level up to, in my opinion, around 95%, which is pretty darn good. by giving them access to another horse. And of course, if you have stables and you've got a line, you can give them access to 2 horses.
Yeah, very true. Or a mirror and a horse, and then
3 horses.
Well, put 2 mirrors, you've got infinite horses.
Yeah,
oh, fantastic.
That's wonderful.
Charlotte's just added, thank you so much. It's been super helpful to hear. So yeah, and from us as well, thank you so much. There's another thank you as well.
Yes,
about how fascinating lecture, loved it so much, thanks. So Andrew, thank you so much from us as well. Like I said, there's been so much information. I'm definitely going to go back and watch it again. I just I feel the need to make sure I'm learning as much as possible from you. So thank you very much. You're coming back, can't remember the date. When's Andrew coming back?
December, is it?
Yeah,
December,
one in December and one on February the, I think
Third.
the 4th, or
Yeah.
3rd or 4th.
Third, yeah. So so there's more to come, folks. So hopefully you'll be back, and there'll be some more really interesting insights from Andrew. So Andrew, from us both, thank you so much. That's been amazing.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for your support, and thanks to all the listeners' support too, and the people over the years who've been supportive. You know, I'm often reflecting that if I didn't have that support, I might have given up, you know, as a lone voice speaking out. But there's been so much support over the years, and now, of course, and many other academics are talking about this sort of thing too. It's wonderful. But really, the support that I've had over the years from people who want to do a better job with their horses and can look past tradition, that's fantastic. And we, you know, turning the mirror onto yourself is such a big thing, but it's a wonderful experience and really revealing, and realizing that maybe we all came from a place that was different, but we can always move on.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And we have to.
It's a great note to end on, and we've learned a lot to try and move on with tonight. So if you want to check out more about Andrew's work and Equitation Science International, it is www.esi-education.com. And there is the diploma in equitation science as well that Andrew mentioned. So do take a look at that on the website and see if that's something for you, if you'd like to learn more in depth. So
thanks, Leah. Thanks a lot, Heidi, and thanks to all the listeners.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye.